Hello and welcome to Evaluate This. I'm Andrew Fryer, and in this short screencast I'm going to show you Replica in Hyper-V. Up until now in this series I've been moving a virtual machine, London SQL, around using various kinds of migration, storage migration, live migration. It's still running, and here it is ticking away merrily with this complicated query I typically run for these demonstrations. But what if I wanted to have a copy of this, a sort of a hot standby, if you will, on some other server, ready to be brought out of a known state as soon as the primary copy failed? That's what Replica aims to achieve. And if I want to do that, the first thing I need to do is to enable Replica on my servers. So if I wanted to make a replica of this onto London 3, for example, then I'd go into my Hyper-V settings here and configure Replica from this option here. You can see it's already turned on, and it's set up for Kerberos, and that's because this host is a member of the same domain as the host on which London SQL is running. Notice this has got nothing to do with the domain that the virtual machine itself is in. That is irrelevant. The other thing I need to set up is where the replica is going to end up on this particular machine. That's all set, so I'll just hit OK. Now currently London SQL is running in a cluster. As you can see here, in HA cluster, it's running as a highly available virtual machine. And notice on the right hand side down here, I've got the option to enable replica. If I do that and specify that London 3 that I've just configured is going to be the host for the replica, I'm going to get an error message. And that's because I need to create something called a Hyper-V Replica broker. And that's needed because London SQL is running in a cluster. If I fail this virtual machine over to London 3, and then I want to fail it back, London 3's got to be able to have some point to bring it back to, and that's what the broker service provides. So what I need to do here is to add another role into this cluster called a Hyper-V Replica broker, as per that warning message. I'll give it a name. Let's call it HA broker. And it's much like creating any other kind of role inside a cluster. And there it is. And it's now running. What I now need to do is configure its replication settings. So I'm going to enable this cluster as a replica server. Yep, that's exactly what I need to do. I need to use Kerberos. Notice this is very similar to the form I filled out for the individual server. I'm going to allow replication from any authenticated server, and I need to specify a location for my files. That needs to be the highly available file server that I've been using in earlier demonstrations. And I'm just going to create a new folder in here called Replica. And I'm done. I get a warning to set my firewall up, but that's okay because I've got group policy in place. So now I've got my replica running in my cluster. I can now go back to London SQL and enable replication. My replica server, as before, is London 3. Okay, it's found it, it's happy with it. It's telling me which disks, and if there were multiple disks here, I could choose which ones to move and which ones not to move. I can specify to have multiple recovery points if I want, and I can have an incremental VSS copy. I'm just going to go for the last one for now. Hit next. And then I'm going to send the initial copy over the network. Now Replica is actually designed to work pretty well over broadband, so you might want to copy your virtual hard disks onto some sort of removable storage and send them to your remote location, and then you can synchronize them on a schedule that you have down the bottom here and start your replica that way, rather than copying a big virtual machine over a slow network. And that's going to start enabling replication. And you can see, if I look at Hyper-V Manager here, that it's actually starting to do that. Notice, as before, that my virtual machine is continuing to run, and I'm going to let that cook away until it's completed. Okay, that has now completed successfully. So now we've got this copy of the virtual machine on London 3. where the primary machine is running on my cluster. So what happens if I try and start this? I'm going to get an error message. And that's a good thing, because you don't want two copies of the same virtual machine on the same network. So if the replica can see the primary, then this won't work. However, what you can do is test failover. So if I go to replication here, I can test my failover, and it will come up with what recovery point I want to go from, and then I can hit test failover. And you can see now we've got a London SQL test virtual machine here. And if I start that, that will start okay. And there's a good reason for it. If I look at its settings, you'll notice that there are no network adapters connected. That's by design. So you might want to hook this up to some internal network for testing purposes so that it doesn't infect your main network and collide with the original virtual machine if that happens to be running. So that's going to come up in a few minutes with exactly the same properties otherwise as the original virtual machine. So complete with SQL Server on it. So things to note. Replica is not an automatic failover. You need to decide when failover is going to occur and manually initiate this on the replica server, in this case London 3. If you do initiate failover, then what you would do is have some scripts perhaps to do that and decide what failover looks like for you in your organisation. Bear in mind that this is no longer going to be running on a cluster. So at some point you're going to maybe want to move it back again, and you're going to need to fail back, and you're going to need to reverse the replication. All of which you can do from here. One final thing to note is that if I go into its settings and expand networking out, from here I'm able to preserve any IP settings I want when the virtual machine fires up in its failover configuration. And notice finally that I've been able to take a virtual machine from a cluster and replica to a single server. I could have done it the other way around. I can go single server to single server or cluster to cluster. So you'll definitely want to be trying this out for yourselves. You are going to need some hardware, and you're going to need an evaluation edition of Windows Server 2012 from the link below. I've been Andrew Fryer. Thank you very much for listening.